The studio lights were brighter than Elvis had expected. They poured down from above, hot against his face, reflecting off the dark blue fabric of his stage suit. Beyond the cameras, hundreds of people filled the studio seats, waiting for the smallest movement from the man they had come to see. Elvis Presley stood just behind the curtain. For a few seconds, he said nothing. He could hear the audience laughing at something Johnny Carson had just said. The familiar sound of Carson's voice floated through the curtain. Elvis smiled faintly. He had performed in front of enormous crowds before. He had walked onto stages where thousands of people screamed his name before he even sang a note. But television was different. On television, there was nowhere to hide. Every smile was captured. Every pause meant something. Every expression could become tomorrow morning's headline. A stage could make a man feel 10 feet tall. A television camera could make him feel completely exposed. Elvis adjusted the collar of his jacket and took a slow breath. A producer appeared beside him. "You're on in 30 seconds. Elvis nodded. "Got it." The producer disappeared. Elvis looked toward the stage again. Johnny Carson was sitting behind his desk, smiling at the audience. Then Carson glanced toward the curtain. "Well, ladies and gentlemen," he said, "our next guest doesn't really need an introduction." The crowd immediately erupted. Elvis heard his name. The cheering grew louder. Carson waited. "And believe me," he continued, "I've learned that when Elvis Presley walks into a room, it's best to move the furniture first." The audience laughed. Elvis shook his head. That was Carson. Always joking. Always testing. The curtain opened. Elvis stepped onto the stage. The reaction was instant. The audience rose to its feet. Applause thundered through the studio. Elvis smiled, waved, and slowly walked toward Carson's desk. Carson stood up. The two men shook hands. "Elvis, it's good to see you." "Good to see you, Johnny." Carson looked him up and down. "That's quite an outfit." Elvis looked at Carson's suit. "So is yours." The audience exploded with laughter. Carson placed a hand over his chest. "Oh, we're going to have trouble tonight." Elvis laughed. He sat down. The applause gradually faded. The cameras moved closer. For the first few minutes, everything seemed perfectly normal. Carson asked Elvis about performing, about traveling, about the crowds, about how strange it was to have millions of people watching nearly everything he did. Elvis answered with his usual charm. But Carson noticed something. Elvis was unusually quiet. Not nervous. Not uncomfortable. Just careful. Carson leaned back. "Elvis, you seem awfully serious tonight." Elvis smiled. "I'm always serious." The audience laughed. Carson raised an eyebrow. "That's not what I've heard." Elvis laughed. "Well, you've heard a lot." Another wave of laughter. The conversation continued. Carson made jokes about Elvis's famous wardrobe. He joked about the sideburns. He joked about the dramatic stage entrances. Elvis played along. But then Carson reached toward his tie. He looked down at it. Then back at Elvis. "You know something." "What?" "I think my tie is missing something." Elvis looked at it. "What?" "Personality." The audience laughed. Elvis leaned forward. "Maybe it needs a better owner." Carson stared at him for a second. Then he laughed. "All right, I walked into that one." The audience applauded. Everything was light. Everything was safe. Until Carson reached beneath his desk. He pulled out a small pair of scissors. The audience immediately noticed. A murmur traveled through the studio. Elvis looked at the scissors. Then at Carson. "What are you doing with those?" Carson smiled. "I was thinking." He held up his tie. "Maybe we should improve the situation." Elvis laughed. "You better be careful." Carson grinned. "Why?" Elvis slowly leaned back. "Because I might improve it for you." The audience laughed. Carson pointed toward Elvis. "That's the Elvis I wanted tonight." He placed the scissors on the desk. Then he looked toward the audience. "How many of you think Elvis Presley should redesign my wardrobe?" Hands went up everywhere. The audience cheered. Carson looked at Elvis. "See, democracy." Elvis shook his head. "You people don't know what you're asking for." Carson picked up the scissors again. He stood. Elvis stood too. The audience became louder. Carson stepped closer. "Just one little cut." Elvis looked at the tie. Then at Carson. "One little cut. That's all." Elvis smiled. "Johnny." "Yes." "You trust me." Carson paused. "Not remotely." The audience burst into laughter. Elvis took the scissors from Carson. He held them between his fingers. For a moment, he looked at them. Then he looked directly toward the camera. The smile remained on his face. But something in his expression had changed. It was subtle. Almost impossible to notice. Almost. Carson noticed. He stopped smiling. "Elvis." Elvis didn't answer. He looked down at Carson's tie. Then toward the collar. He moved the scissors closer. The audience laughed nervously. Someone shouted something from the crowd. Carson lifted both hands. "Wait a minute." Elvis smiled. "Relax." "I'm relaxed." "You don't look relaxed." "I'm watching a man holding scissors next to my neck." The audience laughed again. Elvis chuckled. But instead of cutting the tie, he moved his hand toward the inside of Carson's jacket. Carson stepped backward. "What are you doing?" Elvis reached toward the collar. His fingers touched something. He stopped. His smile disappeared. Carson saw it. The cameras saw it. And for one strange second, the entire mood of the studio changed. Elvis slowly pulled out a folded piece of paper. The audience became quiet. Carson stared at the paper. "What is that?" Elvis looked at him. "You tell me." Carson's expression changed. He knew exactly what it was. The paper had been placed there before the show. A question. A question Carson's writers had prepared. A question that Elvis had never agreed to answer. Elvis unfolded it. His eyes moved across the words. His jaw tightened. The laughter disappeared from his face. Carson stood completely still. The audience had no idea what was happening. They only knew that something had suddenly gone wrong. Elvis folded the paper again. Then he looked at Carson. "Johnny." Carson swallowed. "Yes." "You weren't going to ask me this on television." Carson didn't answer immediately. That silence was louder than any joke. Elvis turned toward the camera. And for the first time that evening, he looked less like the superstar everyone knew, and more like a man who was tired. Tired of being watched. Tired of being questioned. Tired of being treated like a character instead of a human being. The studio was completely silent. Then Elvis did something nobody expected. He smiled again. He held the scissors up, and he pointed them toward Carson's tie. The audience laughed nervously. Carson looked confused. Elvis, Elvis whispered, "Let's give them something else to talk about." He brought the scissors toward the tie, and just before they touched the fabric, the cameras cut to a wide shot. The audience could not see what happened next. Quick audience poll. Before we continue, tell us what you think. If you were sitting in that studio, would you want Elvis to answer the question, or would you want Johnny Carson to protect his privacy? A. Let Elvis answer. B. Protect Elvis and change the subject. And if this story has already caught your attention, hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. We want to know how far Elvis's story has traveled. The cameras returned to Elvis. Carson was laughing. The audience was laughing. But something had changed. Only a few people in the studio knew what had actually happened. Elvis slowly lowered the scissors. Carson leaned toward him. "You know, Elvis." "What?" "I think you just scared my entire production staff." Elvis laughed. "Good." Carson smiled. "But seriously." Elvis looked at him. Carson lowered his voice. "Are you all right?" Elvis didn't answer. Instead, he looked around the studio. At the audience. At the cameras. At Carson. Then he looked down at the folded piece of paper in his hand. He squeezed it tightly. "Sometimes," Elvis said quietly, "people think they know you because they know your name." Carson's smile faded. The audience became still again. Elvis continued. "They know the songs, they know the clothes, they know the movies, they know the pictures." He looked toward the camera. "But they don't know you." No one laughed. Carson leaned back. For once, the comedian had nothing ready. Elvis continued. "They don't know what it's like to walk into a room and have everybody looking at you before you've even said hello." He paused. "They don't know what it's like when people expect you to be happy all the time." His voice became softer. "They don't know what it's like to be Elvis." Carson stared at him. Then he said, "Maybe that's something people forget." Elvis looked at him. "What?" "That Elvis Presley is a person." Elvis's eyes dropped. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then Carson reached across his desk. He held out his hand. Elvis looked at it. He shook Carson's hand. No joke. No performance. Just two men on a television stage. The audience began applauding. At first quietly, then louder. Elvis looked surprised. He hadn't expected that reaction. He smiled. But this time, it wasn't the famous Elvis smile. It was smaller, more genuine. Carson leaned closer. "Can I ask you something?" Elvis nodded. "Why did you really take those scissors?" Elvis looked at the scissors. Then at Carson. A tiny smile appeared. "Because you were wearing an ugly tie." The audience exploded with laughter. Carson stood up. "That's it." He pointed toward Elvis. "Get him out of here." Elvis laughed. The tension finally broke. The studio filled with applause. But Carson wasn't finished. As the audience laughed, he quietly picked up the folded paper. He looked at it, then at Elvis. And without saying anything, Carson tore the paper in half. Elvis watched. Carson tore it again. And again. Then he dropped the pieces into the wastebasket. Elvis stared at him. Carson simply shrugged. Some questions don't belong on television. Elvis's expression changed. He nodded slowly. Thank you. Carson smiled. Besides, he looked down at his tie. I don't want you cutting anything else. Elvis laughed. The audience laughed with him. But behind the laughter, something much deeper had happened. A question had been destroyed. A boundary had been respected. And for a few minutes, the most famous man in the room wasn't being treated like a legend. He was being treated like a human being. The cameras slowly pulled back. The lights remained bright. The applause continued. And Elvis sat there quietly, looking at the audience. For once, he didn't seem to need them to scream. He didn't need them to chant his name. He didn't need to prove anything. He simply sat there and smiled. But neither Elvis nor Carson knew that the strange little moment with the scissors would become the beginning of something much bigger. Because backstage, one of the producers had just discovered something. The question Carson had destroyed wasn't the only copy. There was another. And someone had already taken it. Someone who had no intention of letting Elvis forget what was written on that page. The show continued. The audience kept laughing. The cameras kept rolling. But somewhere behind that curtain, a man was waiting. And he was holding the second copy of the question, waiting for Elvis to walk off the stage. The applause was still echoing through the studio when Elvis finally stood up. He smiled at the audience, gave a small wave, and walked toward the curtain. From the outside, it looked like the perfect television moment. Johnny Carson was laughing. The audience was laughing. Elvis had turned an awkward situation into comedy. But the moment Elvis disappeared behind the curtain, his smile vanished. The backstage hallway was darker than the studio. The bright television lights were gone. The noise of the audience became distant. Elvis stopped walking. He looked down at his hand. He was still holding the folded pieces of the first question. He slowly opened them. The words were still visible. He stared at them. For several seconds, he didn't move. Then he heard footsteps. Someone was coming toward him. Elvis looked up. A young production assistant appeared at the end of the hallway. He stopped when he saw Elvis. "Mr. Presley." Elvis said nothing. The young man swallowed. "I was asked to give you this." He held out an envelope. Elvis looked at it. "By who?" The assistant hesitated. I don't know." Elvis took the envelope. The assistant immediately turned around and walked away. Elvis watched him disappear. Then he looked at the envelope. There was no name on it. No return address. Nothing. He opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Elvis unfolded it. His eyes moved across the first line. Then the second. His expression changed. It was the same question. But underneath, it was something else. A handwritten message. "You can destroy one copy, you can't destroy the truth." Elvis's fingers tightened around the paper. For the first time that night, he looked genuinely angry. Not the theatrical anger people saw on stage. Something deeper. Something personal. He folded the paper and put it into his jacket. Then he heard another voice. "Elvis." He turned. Johnny Carson stood several feet away. Carson wasn't smiling. He had followed him backstage. "Are you okay?" Elvis looked at him. "Did you send this?" Carson shook his head. "No." Are you sure? Absolutely. Elvis studied his face. Carson took a step closer. What did they give you? Elvis didn't answer. Carson sighed. Look, whatever is going on, I didn't know about the second copy. Elvis finally pulled the paper from his jacket. He handed it to Carson. Carson read it. His eyes widened. He looked back at Elvis. Who wrote this? I don't know. Carson read it again. Then he whispered, This isn't one of my writers. Elvis stared at him. Then who is it? Carson didn't have an answer. And that scared him. Because Johnny Carson had spent years working in television. He knew how television worked. He knew how writers worked. He knew how producers worked. And he knew one thing for certain. Nobody got backstage with material like this without someone allowing it. Carson folded the paper. Come with me. Where's my office? They walked down the hallway. Neither man spoke. Behind them, the studio audience continued laughing at the next segment. The television show went on as if nothing unusual had happened. But backstage, Elvis and Carson were trying to understand who had planted the question. When they entered Carson's office, Carson closed the door. He locked it. Elvis noticed. You think somebody's listening? Carson looked at him. I think somebody already was. The room became silent. Carson placed the paper on his desk. Tell me something. What? What's on this question that scares you? Elvis looked away. For a moment, Carson thought Elvis might walk out. Instead, Elvis sat down. He leaned forward. His hands were clasped together. Then he finally spoke. It's about the man before Elvis. Carson waited. Elvis continued. Before the costumes, before the lights, before the screaming. He paused. When I was young, I didn't have anything. Carson nodded. I know. No, Elvis said quietly, you don't. Carson didn't interrupt. Elvis stared at the floor. When you're poor, you learn very quickly that people don't care about your dreams. His voice became softer. They care about whether you can survive. Carson listened. Elvis described the years before fame. The small rooms. The long drives. The uncertainty. The fear of failing. And then came the success. Suddenly, everybody wanted something from him. Managers, studios, promoters, reporters, fans. Everyone wanted a piece of Elvis Presley. But nobody seemed interested in asking what Elvis Presley wanted. Carson leaned back. So the question was going to force you to talk about that. Elvis nodded. On live television. Yes. Carson looked at the paper again. Why would anyone want that? Elvis's eyes hardened. Because somebody thinks they own my story. Carson didn't respond. Then there was a knock on the door. Both men froze. 3 knocks. Slow. Carson looked at Elvis. Who is it? No answer. Carson walked toward the door. He unlocked it. A stagehand stood outside. Mr. Carson. Yes. There's a problem. What kind? The stagehand glanced toward Elvis. The audience is asking where Elvis went. Carson smiled. Tell them he's getting ready. The stagehand nodded. Then he hesitated. There's something else. Carson's smile disappeared. What? Someone was asking about the envelope. Elvis stood. Who? The stagehand shook his head. I don't know. He walked away. Carson closed the door. Elvis looked at him. This isn't an accident. No, Carson said. It isn't. Audience poll. If you were Elvis in that moment, what would you do? A, walk away from the show and protect your privacy. B, stay and confront whoever planted the question. Drop your answer in the comments. And if you're enjoying this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and tell us what city or country you're watching from. We read those comments, and it's incredible seeing how far these stories travel. Back inside the studio, the audience had no idea what was happening. They were watching another comedian perform. People were laughing. Some were eating snacks. Others were whispering about Elvis. They expected him to return. They had no idea that backstage, something much more serious was unfolding. Meanwhile, Carson made a decision. We're going back out there. Elvis looked at him. Why? Because if we disappear, whoever did this wins. Elvis considered that. Then he nodded. They returned to the stage. The audience erupted. Elvis smiled. Carson sat behind his desk. The cameras turned toward them. Everything looked normal. Carson leaned toward his microphone. Well, Elvis has returned. The audience applauded. Elvis sat down. Carson smiled. I hope you didn't get lost. Elvis looked at him. I almost did. The audience laughed. Carson continued with another joke. Elvis laughed. But the two men understood something the audience didn't. They were performing, and someone was watching them. The interview continued. Carson asked Elvis about music. Elvis talked about performing. He talked about the stage. He talked about the feeling he got when the crowd reacted to a song. The conversation became lighter. Then Carson asked, do you ever get tired of being Elvis Presley? The audience laughed. But Elvis didn't. He looked at Carson. Carson realized immediately that the question had landed somewhere deeper than he expected. Elvis slowly leaned toward the microphone. Sometimes. The audience became quiet. Carson nodded. When? Elvis looked toward the cameras. When everybody expects you to smile. A few people laughed nervously. Elvis continued. When you're hurting, they expect you to smile. Silence. When you're exhausted, they expect you to smile. His eyes moved toward the audience. When you're afraid. He paused. They still expect you to smile. The studio was completely silent. Carson looked down for a moment. Then he said, that sounds lonely. Elvis nodded. It is. The answer hung in the air. No joke followed. No laughter. Just honesty. Then Elvis looked toward Carson's tie. He smiled. That's why I cut your tie. The audience burst into laughter. Carson laughed too. The tension broke. But Carson knew Elvis had just told millions of people something important. Not everything about Elvis was glamorous. Not everything about fame was beautiful. There was a man underneath it all. And sometimes that man was tired. The show continued. But during a commercial break, Carson leaned toward Elvis. You're doing okay. Elvis nodded. Better. Carson smiled. Then a stage manager rushed toward them. He whispered something into Carson's ear. Carson's face changed. Elvis noticed. What? Carson looked at him. They found the person who took the second copy. Elvis stood. Who? The stage manager pointed toward the hallway. He says he won't talk to anyone. Elvis walked backstage. Carson followed. They reached a small dressing room. A security guard stood outside. Inside was a middle-aged man. He was sitting alone. When Elvis entered, the man stood. He looked nervous. Elvis stared at him. Why did you take the question? The man didn't answer. Carson stepped forward. Who sent you? Still nothing. Elvis took another step. Why me? The man finally looked at him. And then he said something that stopped Elvis cold. I didn't take it to hurt you. Elvis frowned. Then why? The man reached into his pocket. He pulled out an old photograph. He handed it to Elvis. Elvis looked at it. The photograph showed a much younger Elvis. Not the superstar. Not the man in the famous jumpsuit. Just a young man standing beside a simple car. Elvis stared at the photograph. His face went pale. Where did you get this? The man said, Your story isn't finished. Elvis looked up. What does that mean? The man hesitated. Then he whispered, The person who gave me that question knew you before the world did. Elvis's heart began pounding. Carson looked at him. Elvis. But Elvis couldn't answer. Because suddenly, the mysterious question didn't matter anymore. The photograph did. Someone had found a piece of Elvis's past. Someone had brought it into the studio. And whoever had done it knew exactly where Elvis came from. The man reached into his jacket again. This time, he pulled out a second photograph. He placed it on the table. Elvis looked down. His breathing stopped for a moment. It was an old photograph from years before his fame. A photograph Elvis had never seen publicly. A photograph that should have been buried in the past. Carson looked at it. Then at Elvis. What is that? Elvis didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on one person in the photograph. Someone standing behind the young Elvis. Someone Carson had never heard about. Someone Elvis had spent years trying to forget. Elvis finally whispered. That's why they wanted me to answer that question. The room fell silent. And then the lights in the hallway suddenly went out. For 3 seconds, everything was black. When the lights came back, the man holding the photographs was gone. And on the table was a single handwritten note. Elvis picked it up. There were only 6 words. Tomorrow, everyone will know who you were. Elvis stared at the message. Johnny Carson stood beside him. Neither man spoke, because both suddenly understood. The television show wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The hallway lights flickered once more. Elvis stood completely still. The handwritten note was still in his hand. Tomorrow, everyone will know who you were. He read the sentence again. Then again. Johnny Carson stood beside him, staring at the empty doorway where the mysterious man had disappeared. How did he get out? Carson asked. The security guard shook his head. I don't know. Nobody saw him. No. Carson looked toward the hallway. Then find him. 2 security guards immediately ran in opposite directions. Elvis remained in the dressing room. His eyes were still fixed on the photographs. The first showed him as a young man. The second showed something much more troubling. A person from his past. Someone he had never spoken about publicly. someone connected to the years before fame. Carson picked up the photograph carefully. Elvis. Elvis didn't respond. Who is that? Elvis finally looked at him. My father knew him. Carson waited. Who was he? Elvis took a breath. I don't know what he wanted. Carson looked at the photograph again. But you know him. Elvis nodded. From a long time ago. The room was silent. Then Elvis sat down. He looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. For years, he had built walls around his past. He had learned how to answer questions without answering them. He had learned how to smile when he wanted to disappear. He had learned how to turn pain into jokes. But tonight, those walls were beginning to collapse. Carson sat beside him. You don't have to tell me. Elvis looked at him. Maybe I do. Carson said nothing. Elvis stared at the photograph. When I was a kid, there were people who believed I would never become anything. He smiled sadly. They were probably right. Carson shook his head. No. Elvis looked at him. You weren't there. No, Carson said, but I'm here now. Those words stayed with Elvis. For a moment, he closed his eyes. Then he began talking. Not for the cameras. Not for the audience. Just for Carson. He talked about being young and dreaming of a different life. About being poor. About being laughed at. About people telling him that music wasn't a future. And about one particular man who had once told him something he never forgot. People like you don't become legends. Elvis remembered those words. He had carried them for years. And strangely enough, those words had become fuel. Every rejection made him work harder. Every insult made him push further. Every closed door made him search for another. Eventually, the world learned his name. But the world never learned about the boy underneath it. Carson listened quietly. Then he asked, was that man in the photograph? Elvis nodded. Yes. Why is he back now? I don't know. Carson looked toward the door. Maybe he's trying to remind you where you came from. Elvis shook his head. No. He looked at the photograph again. He's trying to remind me who I was. Carson understood the difference. Where you came from was one thing. Who you were was another. Audience poll. We've reached the moment where Elvis has to decide whether to reveal the truth about his past. What would you do? A. Tell the world everything. B. Keep the past private forever. Leave your answer in the comments. And if this story has kept you watching, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Whether you're watching from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, India, Uzbekistan, or somewhere else in the world, write your city or country below. The producer suddenly entered the room. Mr. Presley, we're ready for you. Elvis stood. Ready for what? The final segment. Elvis looked at Carson. Carson nodded. You don't have to do this. Elvis thought for a moment. Then he smiled. Yes, I do. They walked back toward the stage. The audience erupted when Elvis appeared. Nobody knew what had happened backstage. To them, Elvis was still the same charismatic superstar. The lights, the applause, the cameras, the smiles, everything looked normal. Carson returned to his desk. Elvis sat down. Carson looked toward the audience. You know, we've had some unusual guests tonight. The audience laughed. And I think Elvis has officially destroyed my tie. The crowd laughed again. Elvis looked at Carson's tie. "I told you it needed help." Carson shook his head. "You're never touching my wardrobe again." The audience applauded. Then Carson became serious. "Elvis, before we finish." Elvis looked at him. "I want to ask you one question." The studio became quiet. Carson paused. "Not the question that was written backstage." Elvis nodded. "Ask me." Carson leaned forward. "What do you want people to remember about you?" The question was simple, but it hit harder than anything else that night. Elvis looked down. The cameras moved closer. He could hear hundreds of people breathing. He could hear the faint hum of the studio equipment. For a moment, there was no legend, no icon, no superstar, just a man sitting under bright lights. Finally, Elvis spoke. "I don't want people to remember the clothes." The audience listened. "I don't want them to remember the cars." A pause. "I don't even want them to remember how many records I sold." He looked toward the camera. "I want them to remember that I tried." Carson nodded. Elvis continued. "I came from nothing." His voice trembled slightly. "And there were plenty of people who told me I would never make it." He smiled. "But I kept going." The audience began applauding. Elvis waited. Then he said something that made Carson lower his head. "Sometimes people see success and think that's the story." He shook his head. "The success isn't the story." "What is?" Elvis looked toward the audience. "The struggle." The studio erupted in applause. Elvis's eyes became wet. He quickly looked away. But the cameras caught it. For once, he didn't hide it. Carson didn't make a joke. He simply said, "Thank you." Elvis nodded. The audience rose to its feet. The applause became deafening. Elvis stood. He looked around the studio. Then he looked at Carson. The two men shook hands. But before Elvis walked away, Carson whispered, "You know something." "What?" "I think tonight they finally met the real you." Elvis smiled. "Maybe." He started walking toward the curtain. Then he stopped. He turned around. "Johnny." "Yes." Elvis reached into his jacket. He pulled out the torn pieces of the original question. He placed them on Carson's desk. Carson looked down. "What are you doing?" Elvis smiled. "Keeping your promise." Carson looked confused. "What promise?" "You said some questions don't belong on television." Carson nodded. Elvis pointed toward the torn paper. "So keep this one off television." Carson smiled. "I will." Elvis walked away. The curtain closed behind him. The audience continued applauding. But Carson remained behind his desk for a few seconds. He looked at the pieces of paper. Then he opened the drawer. He placed them inside and locked it. Backstage, Elvis walked alone. The noise of the audience slowly disappeared. He reached the dressing room. He opened the door. The mysterious photographs were gone. So was the handwritten note. Only one thing remained. The scissors. They were lying on the table. Elvis stared at them. Then he smiled. He picked them up. For a second, he remembered Carson's frightened expression when he had brought the scissors toward his tie. Elvis laughed quietly. "Poor Johnny." Then he placed the scissors in his bag. He was about to leave when he noticed something underneath the table. A small envelope. He picked it up. This time there was a name written on the front. Elvis. He opened it. Inside was a photograph. But this one was different. It showed Elvis as a young boy, standing beside his family. Elvis stared at the image. His expression softened. On the back was a handwritten sentence. Never forget the boy who dreamed before the world knew your name. Elvis closed his eyes. A tear rolled down his cheek. He pressed the photograph against his chest. For years, he had tried to outrun his past. But perhaps his past wasn't chasing him. Perhaps it was simply waiting for him to stop. Waiting for him to remember. The door opened. Carson stood there. Everything okay? Elvis nodded. Yeah. Carson looked at the photograph. What's that? Elvis smiled. Home. Carson didn't ask anything else. He simply nodded. They walked out together. The night air was cool. The noise of the studio faded behind them. For a few moments, Elvis stood outside and looked toward the dark sky. He had spent years becoming the man everyone wanted him to be. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, he remembered the person he had been before the fame. The boy with the dream. The boy who didn't know whether anyone would ever hear his voice. The boy who kept trying anyway. Carson stood beside him. You coming? Elvis smiled. In a minute. Carson walked toward the car. Elvis remained where he was. He looked back at the studio. The same place where, only hours earlier, hundreds of people had been screaming his name. He smiled. Then he whispered, "Good night." He walked away. And somewhere inside the studio, Johnny Carson opened the drawer one last time. He looked at the torn question. Then he closed it. He never asked Elvis the question on television. Because sometimes the greatest act of friendship isn't telling the world someone's secret. Sometimes it's protecting it. And perhaps that was the real reason Elvis had picked up those scissors. He wasn't trying to cut Carson's tie. He was trying to cut through the version of himself that the world had created. The superstar. The legend. The impossible image. And for one brief night beneath the television lights, Elvis Presley had managed to do something far more difficult than entertaining an audience. He had simply been himself. No costume. No performance. No legend. Just Elvis. And sometimes, that is the hardest role a person can play.